In Unit 9, we're going to look at user interface design, or sometimes called user experience or UX design, particularly related to Android. Now, this is an area where you can certainly take an entire course. In fact, there are entire majors devoted to this entire job category. So, unfortunately, we will just brush the surface of it and try to relate this to some of the Android development we're looking at. But I think it's important for you to see some of this, and so I will introduce some of the more complicated topics and some of the more design elements just lightly so that you are aware of them. As a developer, you should be aware of this, particularly if you're working with a company that has special UI or UX develop or designers that will work with developers to set the user interface. So let's look at a couple things. Just first, Google has a couple design processes for UI design. The current one is called material design here. And they have a materialdesign.io website that goes through a lot of the materials and has a lot of resources for that. I'm just going to show you a quick video. It's linked here, but it's also linked right here on this. And again, this will just walk you through the UI process um, and how it works, and give you an overview of that. Uh,
Design is more than pushing pixels.
Okay, and that's, I think it's just a 30-second, no, maybe 50-second video, so just a quick introduction to material design here. So that's Google's kind of idea of material design and where they're trying to push a lot of apps. What they're trying to set up is that most apps will have a similar design look and feel to them. That's certainly not true in Android. There are a lot of apps that are just totally different, but that's the idea that Google's trying to push. Um, there's a couple other resources here. This is a quick introduction to material design, some of the goals and principles behind it. And again, I think just kind of glancing through this gives you kind of an idea of what level they're working with. Things like, that motion provides meaning, that we're not moving for any things for arbitrary reason, that when we move an icon or show motion on the screen, it should imply a reason and an idea. And then again, some metaphors for layers and how things are set up, and some design ideas behind how colors are chosen for things. Um, so that gives these three parts to kind of give you a general kind of idea of Google's material design process. And again, when we're working with projects, doing a layout, then we generally want to set the theme to one of these material. There's a material light and a material dark selection. So you should be generally trying to choose one of those. Now, an older one is this halo design, so that's still out there at times. But again, for this class, let's try to use the material dark or material light design themes for things. So now let's try to look at how we actually might get some things up and running and using material design. So again, this gets a little more specific to Android and how Android is setting things up, talks about the styles and the layouts, some of the patterns it uses, some of the animations it uses, but it's still a pretty high level. So it's where the other links are material design in general across all Google platforms. This is a link to material design within the Android area. And one of the areas within this is the material design icons. And so this will allow us to select icons. It's kind of confusing because it has some resources here, but the icons are actually all down here. So these are the standard icons that Google wants you to use for um, most of the menus and things like that. Again, you can design your own icons, but again, these are the ones that Google is pushing for things. And then you can do a search. There's a search at the top. So if we want to do an icon for printing something out, there are some print ones. If we want an icon to open an object, there's an open lock, open in browser, open in new, open with, folder open. So there's some icons here. So again, when you're looking for icons for projects, this is a good place to go for those. These are all openly available and editable. Because we'll be starting to look at setting up menus and using menus and different buttons, and so these sorts of icons are useful when you're creating those menus. So let's talk a little bit about menus. So there are two links in here for for navigating and setting up menus. And I apologize for having so many links in this one. Again, I just want to give you kind of some overall view of this. In some ways, I wish we could spend a couple weeks just on UI interface, but we just don't have that much time. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff, I would you can explore this. But um, if you're just looking at programming, it's just good to be aware of this sort of topics. So let's look at these two links: designing effective menus and also implementing effective navigations. So again, the designing talks about how you want to plan your screens, working with multiple touchscreen sizes, and working with kind of wireframes and their relationships. So again, just talking about how you might want to group your screens, creating a screen diagram to show how you get from one screen to another and move around with a menu, so that if you're here, you might have a menu or a selection that'll go to these three options. From here, you might click down here, and then again, you might have some sort of action button that will go from here to here or slide over. Maybe here you have different screens that you can slide between, and we'll look at some options to then implement some sort of a strategy like this for it. And again, so some of the strategies are under this implementing effective navigations. We'll talk about the basic menus at the top, and we'll also talk about creating a navigation drawer. A navigation drawer is a menu that pulls over from the left side. A lot of Android apps have this menu that pulls over from the left side, which is a larger menu. Some of them just use the menu that is at the top on this bar and use that. So we'll look at both of those options. Another area we'll look at is swiping between tabs, having multiple tabs that you can swipe between. This gets rather complicated to implement, so we won't be well, I'll show you an implementation of this, but I won't have you actually do an implementation of this, but I'll show you how to set it up in case you want. But again, this talks about, here's the design view of it, and here's kind of the idea is that you have one view and then you swipe and you get that. So maybe you have an email box, and then if you click on one of the email messages and swipe one direction, it will display the details of that message. And then if you swipe back, you'll go back to this view. So you have these different views where you can swipe from one to the other and display. And again, we'll look at a worked out example of this soon. So again, this just gives you some, again, overview of this, but we're going to focus on some of the more details here. So we're going to talk about the application bar. This is the bar at the top of the screen. This bar here, and you have a title here for the bar, and then you have a menu here. You can display one or two icons or more depending on your screen size here, and then you can have a menu here. You click this and more menus will pop up, and this is it used to be the primary menu area before we had this navigation panel on the left, and so there's still lots of options and ways of working with this. So we'll work on this in this week's participation activity. You'll set this up and work with this. So besides that menu system, there's also some pop-up messages that show up that can do. So this links into some of these pop-up messages. There's two that are generally out there. One is called Snack Bar, that's the newest one, and one is called Toast. The idea is, toast pops up out of the toaster. So that's where that one originally came from. I'm not sure where Snack Bar came from exactly, but let me just show you an example here. So here I've got this one set up, so if I click on this, rather than sending an email, it just pops up a snack bar message. So this is a snack bar message here. You can have an action here. You can ask them to do something in that, and then you can also drag it off the screen if you don't want it there anymore. I'm having trouble doing that right now with my mouse rather than my finger. The other one is here. If I go up to this, the bar and select from the menu settings, it just pops up a sample toast message. So this is a sample toast message. We've actually had these hidden in a lot of our applications in the past, these little toast messages out there. So to set those up, to set up a toast message, you just have this set of code. You just say toast.make text. You display the message text. You can set how long it is with these constants. And then you just say show to show that message. You do need what is called application context, so you need some link to the main or whatever application you have right now. And this is just generally easy to get at, unless you're sometimes this has to change a little bit, especially with if you're within a listener, like a button listener or something that's not it's an embedded class. You sometimes have to watch and change that slightly. Snack bar is very similar. You say snackbar.make. Again, we have to get a view, and there's a couple ways of doing that. This is one of the standard ways when you're in your application itself. The message you want to display, and again, how long you want to display. Now, then you can also set the action, what you want sometimes there's a button or something you want the users to do something. You can't do that in Toast, but you can do it in Snack Bar. This time here we're setting the action in null, so there's no action. And then again you show that. So again, we won't be going too much into this, but these are common ones. And if you look back at previous examples in this class, you'll see some. And going forward, you'll see these. We'll use these at times also. So we also talked about we just mentioned this app bar and the menus for the app bar here and how to set up menus for the app bar. So again, this is this menu up here. You can display a couple icons, and then this dot dot dot. If you click on that, will pop up another menu here. This whole menu system is all tied together. Um, So again, we've got the option menus at the top. We can have a couple icons up there, and then we have the pop-up menu that pops up when you hit the dot dot dot. We define this whole thing within an XML file for the menu. Uh, so we define a menu object, and then each item within that menu. We give each item an ID, and we'll refer to that in just a sec. We give each item an icon to display, and then we can also say and a title, a string to display, and Android will decide when it can display the icon and when it can display the string, so you should have both available. And then also you can decide where the menu is, whether or not it's going to show up in this top area or not. So sometimes it'll show up on this top bar, and sometimes you'll just have a couple things, and then you have dot 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 for other things. So that's what this show as action. The action is whether or not it's in the top menu bar directly. So this you can say that you want it to show as action or not, or else you can say if there's enough room up there to show it as an action, then show it as an action. Otherwise, it's allowed to go down below in the under the dot 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 pop-up menu. So it talks about some examples of this, and again, we'll walk through this when we look at the participation activity for this. Um, there's another kind of menu out here, and that's the floating context menu. Um, this is an example. This is a floating button here that's here in our application that do certain things. So again, sometimes you have these floating bars, and again, a standard process now in Android is to have a single floating button at the bottom right of your screen to do particular actions for that. Now, to code these, we have to handle the click events. So inside like in this case, the main activity or whatever activity is displaying the menu, you'll have an on option item selected listener here. This will be called when any of the menu items are selected. You'll be given the menu item, and from that you can get the item ID. So you can say item.getID. So you typically in your menu system will have a switch on the menu ID, and then you'll check the ID, and then you'll run different methods depending on what the user has selected. You can have code here directly, but again, we often set up a method there. And again, this ID is tied to the XML file. That's the ID that is listed in the XML file. So that sets up the code for handling the menu. Now you can also do things like change the menus at runtime and do contextual menus and that sort of stuff. We're not going to cover that in this class. We just don't have time, unfortunately. So, but once you get the idea of basic menus, changing them at runtime is not that challenging. Similarly, there's a navigation drawer, and in the assignment this week, we'll be working with the navigation drawer, and that's this pop out here, which is a larger menu system similar to this. So you can design this navigation drawer. You lay it out within an XML file, and you specify the different objects within there. You declare a menu just like we did before for the navigation idea. So here's our items in our navigation drawer. So again, each one generally has an icon and a title. And again, it's pulling the icon from uh, the icon or the drawable locations. And again, we rather than hard coding in the strings, we're pulling these from the string XML file here. So this is and again, each option has an ID, which we'll be using. We can add some headers and things like that. And then to handle the events, there's on navigation item selected listener that runs. And then from that, we'll check which item has been selected and run that. And we'll go over that at the in the assignment this week. We'll walk well, you'll hopefully work this out and get this to work. One other thing is then to view this navigation jar, we usually display this little toolbar or a nav drawer button thing here. So that's usually set up on your screen and set up to work. Now, initially set these up, I suggest you can start with a blank project and set up, but there's a lot of things to get tied together. So I usually suggest, especially new students, when you're going through and creating one of these, you select one of the layouts that has this. So like this layout will have a floating button and the app bar up here and an app bar menu here. So rather than doing a empty layout, you might want to start with this. And again, if you want to do that navigation bar, this one has the navigation drawer all set up and ready to go, and basic code set up for that. It has the floating button and it has this app menu up here. So it has all those built in. So this is a good starting location when you're trying to do these more complicated interface activities. Now we're going to look at having tabbed activities that you can swipe between. And again, if you're doing that, you can set up from scratch, but it gets very complicated to get all this stuff set up quickly. And it helps to just create an initial template that gets you started. So there's a tabbed activity example here that we'll look at. Okay, so there's some sample code for setting up the navigation items, the navigation drawers, and again, some code for when an item is selected, how to check the ID here, and do different things based on what item they've selected here. The last thing we're going to look at is a little more complicated. You're not going to do this in class, but I'm going to show it to you because students often want to do something like this in the final project because they've seen apps that have this interface. And this is the this tabbed interface where you can slide between these. Now, in order to do this, we have to introduce something called fragments, and working with fragments. Now, I find fragments very confusing for new students, so I'm not going to do much with fragments in this course. And there's a lot of discussion in Android developers about fragments and whether or not you should be developing apps with fragments or not. Some people feel very strongly that all apps should have fragments, and others feel they're just way too complicated and add very little functionality for what you need there. So we're going to generally avoid them, except if you want to do this sort of stuff to do it, and it gives you a quick view of what fragments are. I do have a couple links to fragments here. Again, this is totally optional if you want to look up a little bit with fragments, and there's a tutorial from Verkella that's pretty good. But fragments are a way of building kind of a flexible user interface, so you can have your screen broken up into like two fragments, and depending on the size of your screen, if you're on a tablet or your phone, you can display one of the fragments or both of the fragments, and setting things up like that. So that's the idea behind fragments. And so again, uh, we're going to start with a simple example here. Again, I showed you, you can, when you do new, you can set up a tabbed example. So this is basically a tab example with some slight changes. I'm going to switch this back to material light here. And so again, we start with a main activity and a layout for that. The layout contains, again, a couple things. It contains a, okay, and it has this main layout. I've been having trouble with the theme here. I had changed it to the material light, and I had to switch it to this app compatible light, or else the app theme, because I think maybe because I've created this example a while back and not updated it. But it you might, if you're not seeing, or if you're getting an error here, you might want to switch this to app compatible light as your theme. So we've got our main activity and our main layout here. We've got a floating action button down here. We've got our app bar up here where the menu can appear. That's our toolbar shows up here. And then this is a what is called a container view, and this is where our different fragments will show up as in this. And then we'll have a layout for each kind of fragment. So here's our first fragment. Here it just has a frame layout, and then I just have a text view in here. And then the second fragment, same thing. So these are all using the same sort of layout here, but just simple text views, so we can tell which fragments are different. So you can lay out each of your fragments differently and move between them. Let me just show you how this works again. So you run this, you're at the first fragment, you can slide to the second fragment and slide to the third. And so in this case, we just have three fragments set up. We stay within the same activity, and so this menu stays the same. And this button stays the same, because these are defined at the activity level. The fragments just slide in and out. Now, there are some challenges for exchanging information between fragments. It's not as hard as getting information between activities. Remember, we had to often, if we want to send an object between activities, we had to serialize it and send it back and forth. So it's not that bad, but there are some issues. So let's look a little bit at our main activity. Our main activity is getting quite full now because everything here, we have a section pager adapter and a view pager. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but this allows us to move the fragments back and forth. We have our onCreate method, which we've seen before, which sets some things up. And inside that is our floating action button. So if you click on that floating action button right here, it's a email message. We can, here we're just popping up a snack bar message. Whenever you have the app menus up here, we need some something to create those menus at the start when the So that's always code's always in there. And then again, if you select an item from the menu, we do something. And again, we're just here checking if the only item there is a settings option. And so if you click on that, we're just popping up a toast message here. Now, there are some methods for communicating with the fragments, and so you can pass information from one fragment to the other. Right now, it's set up to pass a URI. So it's passing a URI between these, but again, you can change this parameter and pass different information between one fragment and the others. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. Again, we're not going to do this. I'm just going to show you the basics of this. Um, and again, we've got our section page adapter. This is the area within the main activity for where we're displaying our fragments. And so we're deciding which fragment to display in there, and so we're creating the fragments. We define fragment classes here, and we create those, and we can initialize them with some values. Now we're doing this all at the startup. You could also do some dynamic creation of fragments as you need to. We also have this, which lets us move from one, well, kind of sets up the menu to move from one fragment to the other and changes what's the title is displayed at the top when we move from one to the other. And again, most of this code is set up for us when we set up the template. The only thing, it has just one fragment, and so you have to change the code so you can have multiple fragments. And then each fragment has its own layout, like we said, but each fragment has its own class here. So it extends fragments, and we have a new instance and an on crate. So this is, we set up our parameters like before. Here, when we create our fragments, we can pass in parameters. Right now, they're passing in two string parameters to start with. So this is just at creation time if you want to pass in information. So again, these are getting these two parameters, m1, parameter 1, parameter 2 as strings, and using those here at creation. We can also handle button clicks and things like that. Here there are methods for when you attach, when you become active, and when you detach. If you slide off of the screen, what happens there? And then we have this on fragment interaction, which lets us interact with other fragments and pass this URI back and forth. And again, we can change this parameter to pass different information back and forth. So, and then all of our fragments are basically the same. So once you've got one fragment set up, the code, you can create different code. And again, in here, we'd add the code for like processing buttons that are defined in our fragments or things like that. So that just kind of shows you the beginning complexity of something like this. This is tries to show you a map of this sort of stuff. So we have our main activity, and we have our layout for the main activity. We also have a menu layout for the main activity tied into that. We have our different fragments. Each fragment extends the fragment object. I forgot to show you that in the code, but each one is going to extend fragment and inherit from that. Each fragment has its own layout that it uses, and then there's an interface where defined between the main activity and the fragments here, and that's how we can send interactions back to the main class and then send those to each one. And again, within this main class, we have this pager adapter, and that's what lets us page back and forth and have things like set which fragment we want to display, get the count of the fragment, and change the title of the fragment as we go from one to the other. So that's the basic layout of this. There's example code. This code's on GitHub. It runs this. This is the code I've been bringing up. So if you want to look at this, particularly when we get more to the final project, you might want to come back and look at this as an example. But again, this tab fragment stuff will not be on this week's assignment and will not be on your quiz. It's just an option for the final project. Okay, that's all for this week. Hopefully you'll be able to go through the participation activity and the assignments.